Hi everyone, my name is Steph. This is the Novelty Corner and welcome to a slightly different video than I would normally film. This one was an idea that again came from Heather from Here Booktubes, she of the Keeper of Great Ideas for Videos, and she had suggested to me a video around significant books in your life or in your reading history. And at first I thought, great, this sounds like a really fantastic idea and it won't require a lot. I can just pull out, like 10 books from my reading history. And of course I started sitting down, writing down the significant books from my history, and I got to something like 60 plus books and series. So maybe grab a cup of tea. But I think it's worthwhile sharing because many people on my channel have followed me sort of in the last 12 months. And my channel was very different when I first started compared to what it's been in the last couple of years. My channel really only reflects what I've been reading since I started Booktube and not where my reading history started. So we're going to go through my entire life of reading and just pull out books that have significance to me. I'm not going to spend heaps of time talking about the actual books themselves, more about why this book is important to me and where it sits in the timeline of my life. So hopefully you enjoy this. It's a little bit different, but I'm pretty excited to share it with you because of course I had to go back and actually think about, what actually stands out in my life. And the thing is, I wasn't a huge reader as a kid. And so there's only a handful of books from when I was little to sort of my late teens that actually stand out, as opposed to say from 2016 onwards when I had a massive jump in my reading. And so the bulk of the books really come from 2016 onwards. And it was interesting because I went back to Goodreads and I set it to, Infant Scroll on Red and sorted it from earliest date to latest. And it was really interesting to go back and have a look at all those books. And just for the record, that was 2,628 books since 2016. The fact that I got this down to 60 things at all is just a miracle. All right, so if we think about early childhood, my earliest recollection of reading anything was actually an audiobook, and it was an audiobook by an Australian author called Mem Fox, who is a very, very popular children's author here. She's still writing today and releasing books. Her books are just beautiful. The story that I remember most, I remember lots of her stories, but the one that stands out vividly in my mind as listening to it is a story called Wilfred Gordon MacDonald Partridge, which is the story of a little boy who lives next door to what would now be called an aged care facility, and he visits the residents there. And it is absolutely heartbreaking. It does deal with someone who is losing her memories. What I remember about this story is Mem Fox's voice reading the story. She has a very distinctive voice. You can still get the audiobook for it today. It is just beautiful. She has the most gorgeous voice to listen to. It's very soothing. And to this day, I'm still a huge fan of her work. Her books are absolutely stunning. And this one stands out in my mind, despite the fact that, something like Possum Magic is also another book by her that I have known my entire life. But listening to this story, because I actually remember we were at a fair. I can't remember how old I was. My sister and I were quite young. And it was sort of like this outdoor thing. And I think we must have been listening to this audiobook on the way home. It was probably my parents trying to put us to sleep, to be perfectly honest. And that's a cool memory. I don't remember many other books in such specific detail. The things that I do remember are because my mum still has many of our old picture books. So we had the Dinosaur series by Michael Salmon, I think. They were really fun. I love those. And if anyone's wondering where my dinosaur obsession came from later in life, it started young. And we also had tons of the Disney hardback books. To this day, my mum still will pick one up if she sees one because she just likes adding to her collection because it's her collection now. Another book sort of from that time really is from when I used to visit my grandparents. They have this bookshelf in their living room and I used to spend forever just pulling books off. I had no idea what the books were, and looking at the bookshelf now as an adult, I go, I would have not been interested in any of these books. I'm still not interested in any of them, but the one that always captured my attention was this one. It is, I've talked about this before, it is a little book of Shakespeare's sonnets. And I think because I was little and this book was little, it was like I just gravitated towards it. I would always pull it off the shelf and pretend to read it, to the point where eventually my nana gifted this book to me because she's like, I promised that you could have this when you were older, so here it is. So now I own it, which is a really nice piece of my reading history. Then we sort of moved into primary school, and as I said, I was not a big reader as a kid, so I don't remember a lot about what I read during primary school. And in fact, it's probably around year 6 that I start to remember a couple of things. I definitely read Tomorrow When the War Began by John Marsden, very popular dystopian series here. Probably dated and a tad problematic now, but it was huge at the time and everyone read it, and I know we read it for school. And it would be probably 4 years later that I actually had the opportunity to meet John Marsden. I actually went to a camp, a writing camp with him and some other students who'd all applied to go, and it was fantastic. He now runs a school and his school is very different to traditional schooling in Australia. And this was just prior to him starting that school. He actually ran a camp out of the site that is now his school. There was another book that I read, and I think I was trying to figure out which book it was. It was a historical young adult book about the Titanic. And I remember it because it inspired me to write a story afterwards. And I think the book was called Titanic, The Long Night by Diane Ho. It could be the wrong one, but this one seems familiar and I recognize the cover, so I'm going to go with that. I remember it because I did the story afterwards and okay. Random, but also probably it came out around the time of the film, so that makes a lot of sense. And of course I did all the regular things, like I was reading The Babysitter's Club and I was reading Sweet Valley High. Those were sort of the staples at the time. Then we get to high school, and I actually moved states for the first 2 years of high school. My dad started a job in Sydney, so we moved to Sydney for 2 years. I know definitely here I was reading the Animorphs because one of my friends at the time had gotten me into that. I was also gifted the 4th book in the series that shall not be named, but that was a period of time where I was reading those books. But it was in year 8 that I started reading Michael Crichton because I found Jurassic Park in the school library, and I was in a new school. I found it really stressful. I did have some friends, but I was still the new kid, even, you know, in year 8, and I'm not a social person anyway. So I found Jurassic Park, absolutely fell in love with it, borrowed it from the school library, went back to the school library and got out a copy of The Lost World, which to this day is still my favorite of the 2 books. And that's where my love of that series started, in year 7 and year 8. Did I understand the mathematical and scientific concepts in the book? Absolutely not, but I had a great time reading it. The other book I remember from year 8 was because of the way that my school structured their English classes. Had I stayed there for year 9, we would have done 4 units over 4 semesters from year 8 to year 9 based on genres. And I know I did a mystery unit. That was my first one. I have a feeling we might have read Agatha Christie, but I can't remember if we did or which book it was. I remembered my second unit because it was a sci-fi unit. And one of the books that we read was Galax Arena by Gillian Rubinstein, and that sticks out very clearly in my head. It really bothers me that I can't remember the first book that we read for that class. I don't know, if it comes to me, I'll insert it here, but I remember I really enjoyed it because it was the first time I got to read a genre that I actually really enjoyed. Then we come to year 9 and we moved back to Melbourne. I started at a new school again, and year 9 is the worst time to start at a new school, but anyway. So I spent a lot more time in the library, and I discovered Matthew Riley. And every time I talk about this part of my reading history, it amazes me that this book existed in a private girls' school library because of what this book is. It is probably one of the most violent books that I have read to this day. I read this, absolutely fell in love with it, fell in love with Matthew Riley's writing, went back, read Contest, read Temple, which were the only other 2 books out at the time, and then bugged my parents so much because I think around that time, his follow-up to I Station, which was Area 7, came out. And I remember this was a book that, not this copy, but this book, was a book that I got for Christmas around about the same year. And I stayed up all night reading it to 2 o'clock in the morning. Like, I did not go to bed. I sat on the couch. It was not a very comfy couch. And I read till all hours, and my parents just let me. And I am very grateful to them for that, because these 2 books are still 2 of my favorite Matthew Riley books. Then from year 10 onwards, like the last 3 years of high school, I started getting into high fantasy. So even though I am no longer a fantasy reader, I was very much a fantasy reader for the last part of my high school years. Someone got me on to Daughter of the Forest by Juliette Marillier. Magician by Raymond E. Feast was one of my favorite books. That book is a chunker. I don't actually know where my copy is. I know I lent it to someone and I clearly never got it back, which is fine because let's be real, I'm not going to go back and reread it now. And in fact, it sort of lives rent-free in my brain as a time where I did enjoy fantasy books. I enjoyed the world building. I enjoyed when the books were really long, but if I went back to read it now, I would probably change my opinion of that, so that's fine. I read things like Battle Axe by Sarah Douglas. It was around this time I was working at KFC, and one of my co-workers, who was a couple of years older than me, knew I liked Star Wars, and he lent me a whole stack of Star Wars books. This is where my Star Wars book thing kicked off. He lent me the Rogue Squadron and Wraith Squadron books. He also lent me the New Jedi Order, and I inhaled those books. So I will insert a photo of my collection now because I've started my own. He lent me all of them, I read them, I gave them back, and then I started collecting them for myself. Then in my early 20s, I started working at Borders, and I started just before Eclipse came out by Stephanie Meyer. So I lived through 2 Stephanie Meyer releases, and can I tell you that those were insane periods of time to be working in a bookstore. Like, they were. Chaos incarnate in the best possible way. So that's when I started to read Twilight, because Eclipse came out and I was selling the books, but I had no idea what they were. So I went through and read the series. And I was also there for when The Host by Stephanie Meyer came out. And to this date, I think that is probably her most intriguing story to me. I don't know if it was executed particularly well, but in terms of the concept, it was great. And I would go back and reread that because I thought it was a really cool idea for a story. Somewhere in here, I also read The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. Again, this was in a period where apparently reading really long, slow-paced books was my jam, and I read it. Again, this is probably not a book I could read again and still hold the same memories for, but at the time it was a book that I fell in love with. And I know during this period, I bought a ton of books because I was working in the bookstore and I got the best discount on books. But you know, those were sort of the main ones that I can remember. And then I also remember, this is an interesting part of my reading history, and considering what I know I can read and enjoy now, this makes a lot of sense. So I also somehow stumbled onto the Mary Gentry series by Laurel K. Hamilton, which, if you know, is a bonkers bananas, completely weird, random, very, very steamy, paranormal series. It involves fae who look like all sorts, like these were probably some of the original monster romances. I read them and it blew my tiny little mind, let me tell you. And here's the thing, I have not read them since then, but I do own some of them. And I'm very, very tempted to go back and revisit them because I vividly remember reading them. And I know that they are probably highly problematic and are probably not very great these days, but I'm kind of curious to go back. So if you're interested in that, let me know, because I'm quite happy to do that. And then there is a huge period of time, particularly when I first started teaching, where I just didn't read. I didn't have time. I was exhausted. I was trying to figure out my career and how it all fit together. And while I was probably reading a book here or there, there was nothing that stands out to me. So there's like a 5-year gap in here where I couldn't tell you what I read. And then we sort of hit my late 20s and my early 30s. And I found Booktube. So we're talking 2014, 2015, 2016 is when I found Booktube, and then I started reading a lot. So I think I started my YouTube channel in 2014, but I don't think I started talking about books until 2016. So sort of in that 2-year period is sort of when I transitioned from one type of content to another. And of course, at that time, I started by reading a lot of the popular YA books that were out. Things that are important to me, I suppose, are The Illuminae Files by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. And I know there's some problematic stuff with Jay Kristoff, but this particular series lives rent-free in my brain as something that was unique and different and sci-fi. It was young adult, but it was amazing, and it has the most incredible audiobooks for it. Like, it's a huge part of my reading history. It was also around this time that I found out about Ellie Marnie and her Every Breath series, which is a Sherlock Holmes retelling set in Melbourne. It's young adult. It's fantastic. There are 3 books in the series and I highly enjoy them. Somewhere in here I also read Starry Eyes by Jan Bennett, and this is easily one of my favorite young adult contemporary books. It does feature a romance. It is really fun, and I just remember reading this and rereading this many times, particularly at the start of the year in summer, because that's the kind of vibes that it gave me. Another really important book to me from around this time was The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. World War II history books are everywhere, we know this. There were lines in this book that just constantly stood out to me, and I loved the fact the narrator of the story was deaf. Like, to me, that was just perfection. There are some quotes in here that will forever be my favorite quotes from the book. So while I don't gravitate towards World War II history books anymore, like, this one is probably the one that I would go back to if I did. I also read and fell in love with the Skullduggery Pleasant series by Derek Landy. This is a middle grade series, and it's one that I read with my class as well. So that was really important and a big part of my memories of this book, because they absolutely loved it. They'd never heard of it. They'd never tried to read it. And we read the first book and they quite literally told me, we're not reading a different book. We need to read the second book next. And they're not short books. They take a while to read if you're reading it as a class read aloud, but they wanted to spend that time reading the second book. And then I basically never saw the rest of the series that I owned again, because they kept taking them off the classroom bookshelves. So when you have a book like that, to me, that's an important part of my history, because that was when I was teaching the older kids, which is not my preference, but we found something that we had in common and something that we really enjoyed reading together. I also read Sarah J. Maas during this time. I mean, at that point, that was everywhere. I did start with Throne of Glass, but also A Court of Thorns and Roses came out, and then A Court of Mist and Fury came out, and you know, there was all of that fun craziness that was happening on Booktube. I also did A Darker Shade of Magic by V. Schwab. One book that I still can't believe, or one series that I can't believe I read at this time, was The Passage by Justin Cronin, and then the following 2 books, because there is no reason why I should have picked this book series up. It's one of those books that came to me because someone in my family had talked about it. My dad had seen the author interviewed because Justin Cronin was going to the Melbourne Writers Festival. And my dad does not pay attention to books. He has absolutely no clue what I read. But I remember he came to me and said, because he knew I was reading, and he's like, I just heard this author talk, this book sounds really interesting. And I happened to go to the Melbourne Writers Festival that year and I picked up all 3 books in the series, because of course I did. And these things are chunky. Like, one of the books is over 1,000 pages long and it took me a very long time to read them. It's one of those series that I would not have picked up, but my dad had talked about it and he thought I would like it. And so in my head I went, my dad never talks to me about books. He never suggests anything for me to read. I'm gonna read it. So I did. It was also in this sort of time period, the first couple of years on Booktube, where I got my first 2 arcs. So one of them was from NetGalley. It was Off Base by Annabeth Albert, which was an military romance, and Annabeth Albert is still an author I read to this day. I got my first physical arc, which was Third Time Lucky by Carly Lane, which also kicked off me reading many of Carly Lane's books. And I've been very lucky to have been blurbed on some of her books as well, which is amazing. Also at this time, I was reading things like The Martian, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers, which is still one of my all-time favourite books. The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, which I totally bought because of the cover. This is totally my aesthetic, but I read and fell in love with it. And again, this is not a book necessarily that I think I can go back to, because I think my tastes have changed enough that I don't know if I would enjoy it the same way. But when I first read this, I pretty much lay on the couch and read it from cover to cover. I could not put it down. And I just loved the beauty and the magic of it. And those are all my memories tied to this book, so I keep it because it's important to me. I read Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang, which holds one of my favourite short stories ever, Story of Your Life. It was made into the film Arrival, one of my favourite films of all time. I sobbed through that story. I sob through the film every time I watch it. But this was a really interesting speculative fiction collection, and I had not really read anything like that. But I read it because someone had said, you will like this story, so read it. Also, specifically in 2018, because I wasn't sure where I started these series, but it was definitely in 2018, I started reading the Guild Hunter series. Now, this is the first book. The reason I picked up this series is because I found a copy of must have been book 8, in a bookstore and picked it up because I really liked the cover and thought, oh great, an angel book. Didn't realize it was book 8. So I bought book 8 and then realized it was book 8 and I needed to start from the beginning. And so I started reading Guild Hunters by Nalini Singh, which of course then led me to reading the Psy Changeling series in 2018. I actually thought I'd started picking these up later than I did, but clearly not. And also around this time, I started reading Kate Daniels for the first time by Ilona Andrews. If this doesn't sum me up at this point in my life, I don't know what else does. Then in 2019, probably the most significant books that I read at this time were The Dry and Force of Nature by Jane Harper. And the reason that these were significant, I remember exactly where I read these. It was September. My family were going on a holiday. We were going to Palm Cove. We were sitting at the airport and my sister pulls out a copy of The Dry. My sister, for the record, is not a big reader. She very rarely reads physical books, and she definitely doesn't read fiction books, but someone had given her the book and so she decided to read it. And we're sitting in the airport and I said, well, I've never read it. She'd only read like the first page or two. I said, I'll download it on my Kindle and I'll read it with you so we can talk about it. So my sister and I read The Dry together on the way to Palm Cove, and while we were there, we both finished it while we were there, which is another miracle for her because it takes her a long time to read books, but she really loved it. And then she really wanted the second book. So while we were in town at one point, I went and found her a physical copy because I downloaded it, but we got her a physical copy. And since then, I have loved reading Jane Harper's books, and it's thanks to my sister who doesn't read. I also remember reading on this particular holiday A Lesson in Thorns by Sierra Simone, and also being totally blown away by what the hell this book is. And also I think around the same time I started reading the Expanse series because the TV series had come out, and so I'd started watching the show and then I realized I probably should read the books. And then we come to 2020 onwards, which to be honest is the kickstarting of my romance reading. I mean, I was reading romance beforehand, I just wasn't calling it romance, and I wasn't reading them often enough to consider myself a romance reader. It was sort of here or there, and it was a review copy or something like that. And really what kicked that off was when Kirsty picked my TBR, it was for a vlog, and she recommended The Hating Game. And I read it and I loved it and I have not looked back since. From there, I went to things like Managed by Kristen Callahan, which lives rent-free in my brain as one of the best Grumpy Sunshine books ever. I also read around this time Strangelove by Anna Guire, which was my introduction to one, sci-fi romance, but also weird romance, and it's a delightful book. If you haven't read it, it's actually a really, really sweet book. It was around this time that Wicked Villains came out by Katie Robert, which was a real eye-opening series. I read my first Alexis Hall, which was boyfriend material, and I have since then moved on to pretty much as I can get my hands on by him. But you know, this was the first one that I read, probably because it was trad published and it was everywhere, but you know, I absolutely fell in love with the writing style and then went on to try other books by Alexis Hall. I also read the new Camelot series by Sierra Simone. Again, very eye-opening series, and I know this is not a really popular one with everyone because of what happens in book 2, but this made me fall in love with Sierra Simone's writing style and was probably the start of my why choose polyamorous romance era, because it had to start somewhere. Then we come to things like Green Creek by TJ Klune. And look, I had read The House on the Cerulean Sea before this, I'm pretty sure, but this was the series that I absolutely just fell head over heels in love with and just embraced the fact that I'm going to cry and bawl my eyes out in books constantly. This book, you guys know how much I love this series as a whole and how important it is to me. So like that's where this all started. I'm pretty sure that was around the end of 2020. Then I was reading things like I Married a Lizard Man, which I got because I was part of a group of people who were trying to read as many weird monster romance books, and some of those people are now some of my best friends on Booktube. But we sort of started as this little splinter group of people who are like, well, I want to read this really weird thing. Can you find anything weirder? And it was great. Then we have things like Necessary Evils by Only James, which is probably iconic just for the fact that it had killers who are absolutely loyal to their partners and just ridiculously adorable and sweet despite the fact that they do horrific things. There is something like With You Forever by Chloe Leese, which just featured representation that I wish I had seen over and over again in other books, and was just done in such a beautiful way with characters I absolutely fell in love with. Running Wild by K.A. Tucker was a book that I did not expect to like, given that it follows on from a series with characters who I loved, and where the heroine in this book is the other woman really in those two books. But where when you read this story, I have never felt more seen as a 30+ woman in a book than when I first read this. And it was just one of those books where I went, this reminds me so much of the way I think and the way I think about my life, and to see myself reflected in here. And we're sort of coming to the end, and I was thinking about, you know, well, so what books define me now? Not necessarily books that I'm known for, although they probably are that because I don't shut up about them. I think one series that I couldn't not mention is the Criminal Intention series by Cole McCade. One thing that I don't talk about a lot is that I used to watch a lot of crime shows. They were some of my favorite things to watch growing up. And this series really takes me back to that, but it does it in a way that highlights both the way that the police and the justice system is broken, but it also features an incredibly diverse cast of characters. It is reflective of the way society is, but it also still has that on your edge seat element of a crime show that is what drew me into watching those types of shows in the first place. To me, it gives me that rush and that nostalgia feeling while also still being a really incredibly well-told story. I wanted to mention Gravity because I remember exactly when I read this, and I know it wasn't that long ago, but I think I will always remember when I read this. This was gifted to me off my wish list, and I think I'd only put it on my wish list because it was Tal Bauer. This was only the second Tal Bauer book that I'd read. I said, oh, okay, that sounds good. I've read hockey romances in the past. Okay, we'll put it on the TBR and at some point I'll get to it. But someone gifted it to me and I read it. I read it on the very last day of 2022. 2022 was a rough year, and I wanted to end the year on a note with a book by an author that I knew wrote really well. And I read this and I just loved it. It is a really beautiful story, and I'm like, oh great, I've ended the year well. But then of course we get to the end of January in 2023 and the rest of the story came out. This book, I love the romance in it. I love everything about this book. I love the writing style. I love the love story. I love the found family element. I love everything about this. But I think I said the last time I read it, the one thing that I think keeps me coming back to this book is the organizational change that happened within this team. And I think it's so important to me because it came at a time where I was, and still am to some extent, going through a lot of that in my own workplace, and I think it helped me process. And so there's like those two sides of the coin. There's just the stuff that I love in a good romance book, but there's also the way I see reality reflected and the way it helped me to process my own experiences. Hands down my favourite book of the year, one of my favourite books of all time. So yes, that is my little trip down memory lane with all of these books that I have read over the last 36 plus years. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes next because I think my reading always goes in cycles. I know it does for many, many people. The genres I read, the types of stories I want to read, it always comes in waves, and it's nice to look back and reflect on where you've been, where you currently are, and then to come back to that when you inevitably move into a new phase. So yes, thank you very much for watching. If you've stuck out this video, well done. I'd love to know in the comments if there are books that are really important in your reading history. Even if you just want to share one of them that's important to you, I'd love to know what it is. If you want to let me know that you're here but you don't want to leave a comment, feel free to leave a book stack emoji down below. If you want to support the channel, there's a couple of different ways you can do so. They're also listed in the description. Feel free to take a look. Otherwise, I hope that wherever you are in the world, you're staying safe and healthy, and I will see you in my next video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye everyone.